In 1947, a small-town physician in rural Kentucky refused to sign 3 birth certificates. The infants were alive, they were breathing. But Dr. Howard Metz wrote one word across each form before walking out of the delivery room, and that word was incomplete. The mothers never saw what he saw. The fathers were told to burn the medical notes, and for 60 years the town of Millridge pretended the Ulridge sons were never born at all. But they were, and worse, they lived. This isn't folklore. This isn't myth dressed up as memory. This is what happens when a bloodline is poisoned long before anyone knows to look for the source. The Ulridge family tree didn't branch, it knotted. It folded back into itself like a fist closing on its own fingers. And by the time the sons arrived, the damage was already written into their cells, into the architecture of their faces, into the way their eyes didn't quite track movement the way human eyes should. The town knew something was wrong the moment the boys started school. They didn't speak in full sentences until they were 9. They moved in unison, even when separated by rooms. Teachers reported that all 3 would stop writing at the exact same moment, mid-word, and stare at the door as if someone had called their name. But no one had. No one ever did. The Ulridge sons existed in a silence the rest of Millridge couldn't hear, but could feel, like a draft from a door that was never opened. Their father, Samuel Ulridge, was a man the county had already forgotten how to talk about. A recluse who only came to town for flour and kerosene, his hands always shaking, his eyes always wet. People said he'd married his second cousin. Others said it was worse than that. But no one asked, because asking meant you'd have to hear the answer. And in 1947, in towns like Millridge, you didn't go looking for answers that made the church bells feel heavier on Sunday morning. By the time the sons were 12, 2 of them had stopped aging. Not in the way you'd expect. They still grew taller, their bones still lengthened, but their faces stayed smooth, frozen in that strange place between child and something else. The third son aged faster. His hair went gray by 15. His back bent like an old man's, and when he looked at his brothers, there was no recognition in his eyes, just the dim, wet gaze of something trying to remember what it used to be. The genealogy didn't make sense until someone finally mapped it. In 1989, a graduate student from the University of Louisville came to Millridge, doing research on Appalachian family structures. Her name was Caroline Voss, and she thought she was documenting survival strategies in isolated communities. What she found instead was a family tree that looked like a medical diagram of a genetic catastrophe. The Ulridge line had been folding back on itself for 4 generations, cousins marrying cousins, uncles who were also grandfathers, siblings whose children carried identical mutations because the gene pool had gone still as a locked room. Caroline never published her research. She left Millridge 3 weeks early, and according to her graduate advisor, she burned her notes in a trash can behind the university library. When asked why, she said only this: because some families aren't supposed to continue. And the Ulridge sons prove it. She refused to elaborate. She left academia entirely, and the draft of her thesis, the one her advisor managed to save, contained a single highlighted passage. The sons do not have individual names in town records after 1959. They are referred to collectively, as if they are one organism experiencing 3 separate failures. The truth is uglier than that. The sons weren't just genetically compromised, they were mentally uninsured. By the time they were 16, none of them could be left alone. If separated for more than an hour, they would begin to scream, not in fear, not in pain, but in a frequency that made windows crack, that made dogs in the neighboring county start howling in unison. The sheriff's department responded twice. Both times, the deputies left without filing reports. One of them quit the force a week later. The other started drinking and never stopped. Samuel Ulridge built a room in the back of the house where all 3 sons slept in the same bed, the door locked from the outside. Neighbors reported hearing a low hum coming from that room at night, like the sound of a generator running underwater. But there was no generator. There was no machinery. Just 3 boys lying side by side, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating in the same failing rhythm. The town doctor, the one who replaced Howard Metz after he disappeared in 1952, was called to the house once. He arrived in the afternoon. He left before dark, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold. He told his wife that night, and she later told her sister, and her sister told the woman who ran the general store, "Those boys aren't dying. They're not living either. They're somewhere else, and they've been there for years. And whatever's keeping them in that place, it's not medicine and it's not God." Samuel Ulridge died in 1961. Heart failure, the county said. But the coroner's assistant, a man named Raymond Poole who still lives in a nursing home outside Lexington, tells a different story. He says Samuel's body was found in the locked room with his sons. He says the man's face was blue, his eyes wide open, and his hands were clawing at his own throat, as if he'd been trying to breathe through a space that had closed from the inside. The assistant also says this: all three sons were awake when the body was discovered. They were sitting upright in bed, staring at their father's corpse, and they were smiling. No one knew what to do with the sons after that. Samuel's wife had died years earlier during a fourth pregnancy that the hospital refused to document. There were no other relatives willing to claim them. The state tried to intervene, but the caseworker assigned to the Elridge file quit after her first home visit. Her resignation letter, obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2003, contains only 2 sentences. I do not believe these individuals are capable of integration into society. I do not believe they are individuals at all. So the sons stayed in the house, alone, for 13 years. The county kept the utilities running out of some vague bureaucratic obligation no one could quite explain. A local church group tried to bring them food once a month, but after the second visit, they stopped. The pastor's wife, a woman named Eleanor Rigby, yes, that was her real name, said the sons never spoke to them, never acknowledged them. They would simply stand in the doorway, all 3 of them, perfectly still, and wait until the visitors left. Eleanor said their eyes were always open, but they didn't blink. Not once. Not in the 15 minutes she stood there trying to introduce herself. The house began to rot around them. The roof leaked. The walls grew black with mold. Animals stopped coming near the property. Birds wouldn't land on the fence. Deer that used to graze in the field behind the house started taking routes half a mile out of their way to avoid it. A state wildlife officer, doing a survey of the area in 1970, noted in his report that the land around the Elridge home showed unexplained absence of insects, rodents, and soil bacteria consistent with contamination or deliberate eradication, though no chemical agents were detected. And still the sons remained. People driving past at night said they could see shadows moving behind the windows, always 3 of them, always in formation. A teenager, drunk and daring, broke a window with a rock in 1968. He said he did it to see if they'd react. They did. All 3 sons appeared in the broken window within seconds, their faces pressed against the jagged glass, staring at him. He ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the main road. When the sheriff asked him what scared him, he said it wasn't what they looked like. It was that they moved exactly the same way, at exactly the same time, like one mind operating 3 bodies, like a system that had learned to survive without becoming human. In 1974, the house burned. No one knows how it started. The fire department arrived to find the structure fully engulfed, the flames so hot they could feel the heat from the road. They didn't go inside. The chief made that decision within 30 seconds of arrival, and he's never explained why. But the firefighters who were there that night, the ones still alive and willing to talk, they all say the same thing. The sons were standing in the front yard when they arrived, all 3 of them, unburned, barefoot in the snow, watching the fire like it was something on television. The fire burned for 4 hours. By dawn, there was nothing left but the foundation and a smell the neighbors said lasted for weeks. Not burning wood, not chemicals, but something organic and wrong, like meat that had been dead for too long before someone tried to cook it. The sons were gone by the time the embers cooled. No one saw them leave. No one saw them walk away. They were simply not there anymore, as if they had evaporated with the smoke. For 3 years, Millridge didn't talk about them. It was as if the fire had performed some kind of ritual closure, burning away not just the house, but the memory of what had lived inside it. People stopped driving past the property. The county let the land go to auction, but no one bid. It sat empty, a blackened scar on the edge of town that everyone learned to look past, the way you learn not to see a stain on the wall after long enough. But in 1977, a mailman named Douglas Fenwick reported seeing 3 men standing at the edge of the old Elridge property. He said they were watching the road. He said they looked exactly the same as they had when they were 20 years old, which by that point they should have been in their 30s. He filed a report with the post office, not the police, because he said he didn't want anyone thinking he was crazy. The report was ignored. But 2 weeks later, a woman driving through Millridge at dusk said she saw 3 figures standing in the middle of Route 9, just past the turnoff to the old Elridge land. She swerved to avoid them. Her car hit a tree. She survived, but she was never the same. Her daughter said she would wake up at night screaming that they were still standing there in the road, waiting for someone to stop. The sightings continued sporadically for years. Always 3 figures. Always in the same area. Always described the same way, not moving, not speaking, just standing and watching. In 1983, a hunter claimed he saw them in the woods near the property. He said they were facing him, perfectly still, about 30 yards away. He raised his rifle, not to shoot, but because he didn't know what else to do. He said the moment he looked through the scope, all 3 of them turned and walked into the trees in perfect synchronization, their footsteps making no sound. He packed up his gear and left. He never hunted in that area again. Here's what the medical records say, the ones that were finally unsealed in 2001 after a lawsuit by a genealogical research group. The Ulrich sons were born with a condition so rare it didn't have a name in 1947. It still barely has one now. Extreme consanguinity syndrome, some researchers call it, others just call it genetic collapse. Their DNA showed markers consistent with multi-generational inbreeding so severe that certain chromosomes had become nearly identical. They weren't just related, they were echoes of the same broken genetic code, repeated and amplified until the errors became the structure. Their brains showed abnormalities on every scan taken during the one medical evaluation conducted in 1965, when the state briefly tried to have them institutionalized. The neurologist who reviewed the scans noted that the son's brain activity was synchronized, not similar, but identical, firing in the exact same patterns at the exact same intervals. He wrote in his report, "It is as if they share one consciousness distributed across 3 bodies. I have no scientific framework to explain this. I do not believe one exists." The evaluation was never completed. The sons were released back to their home after they stopped responding to any stimuli. They wouldn't eat. They wouldn't sleep. They would only sit in chairs, side by side, staring at the wall. The doctors said keeping them in the hospital was pointless. But the real reason, according to a nurse who was there, was that the other patients had started reacting to their presence. Screaming at night, refusing to go near the wing where the sons were kept. One patient, a man recovering from a stroke, told the staff that the sons weren't patients. He said they were something else, something that had learned to wear human shape, but had never learned to fill it correctly. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have tried to help them? Or would you have done what Milridge did and pretended they were never born at all? The last confirmed sighting of the Elridge sons was in one notable. A state road crew working on Route 9 just after dawn reported seeing 3 men standing in the burned foundation of the old Elridge house. The 4 men, a man named Carl Dempsey, said they were just standing there, in the center of the blackened concrete, facing east toward the rising sun. He said they didn't move the entire time his crew was there, nearly 40 minutes. He said he tried to approach them, to ask if they needed help, but the closer he got, the harder it became to move forward. He described it like walking into a wall of cold air that pushed back. He gave up at about 20 feet. He said their eyes never blinked. Their chests never rose or fell, and when the sun finally cleared the trees and the light hit them directly, they were gone, not walked away, just gone. Carl Dempsey died of a heart attack in 1997. In his last weeks, according to his hospice nurse, he would wake up at night and say the same thing over and over. They're still there. They're always there. They're waiting for the rest of us to figure out what they already know. So what happened to the Elridge sons? The official answer is nothing. There is no death certificate, no missing persons report, no record of them leaving Kentucky or entering any institution, hospital, or care facility anywhere in the United States. They simply stopped existing in documented reality, the same way they barely existed in it to begin with. But the unofficial answer, the one you hear if you spend enough time in Milridge talking to people old enough to remember, is that they never left. That they're still there, in some form, in some layer of existence that runs parallel to ours, but never quite touches it. There's a woman in Milridge, now in her 70s, who refuses to give her name, but who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. She says her father was one of the deputies who responded to the Elridge house in 1958, the night the sons started screaming. She says her father came home that night and locked himself in the bathroom for 3 hours. When he came out, his hair had gone white at the temples. He was 31 years old. He told her mother that the sons weren't screaming because they were in pain. They were screaming because they were trying to communicate something that human vocal cords weren't designed to express. He said it sounded like language, but not one that had ever been spoken by anything that lived in normal time. Her father died young at 47 of a brain aneurysm. But before he died, he made his daughter promise something. He made her promise that if she ever saw 3 men standing together, not moving, not speaking, just watching, she was to turn around and leave. No questions, no curiosity, just leave. Because, he said, the Elridge sons weren't waiting for help. They were waiting for company. And the longer you looked at them, the more they could see you. And once they saw you, really saw you, you became part of whatever they were, part of the structure that kept them suspended between being born and being alive. In 2006, a film student from the University of Kentucky tried to make a documentary about the Elridge sons. She got funding, she got permits. She even got interviews with 3 people who claimed to have seen them. But the project was never completed. The student, Melissa Hargrove returned all the funding and destroyed all the footage. When her thesis advisor asked why, she said only this: because I started having the dreams. And in the dreams, I was one of them. And I could feel what it was like to be them. And I don't want to feel that again. She dropped out of the film program. She works as a school librarian now. She won't discuss the Elridge sons. She won't even acknowledge she ever tried. The property where the house once stood is still empty. The county has tried to sell it 4 more times since 1990. Every time the sale falls through. Twice. The prospective buyers backed out after visiting the land. One of them, a developer from Lexington, said he felt watched the entire time he was there. He said the air felt heavier near the foundation, like walking into a room where the oxygen is slowly being removed. The other buyer, a man who wanted to build a hunting cabin, said he saw 3 shadows standing in the tree line at dusk. He said they were perfectly still. He said they looked like they were waiting for him to step closer. He left. He never came back. The Elridge sons force us to confront something we don't want to acknowledge. That humanity isn't guaranteed. That being born in human form doesn't mean you get to be human. That some bloodlines carry damage so deep, so structurally embedded, that the people who inherit it aren't people anymore. They're monuments to every failed decision that came before them. Walking evidence that biology can turn on itself, that genes can become a prison, and that sometimes the cage is built long before the prisoner is born. The town of Millridge doesn't talk about them anymore. The few people who remember have learned not to bring it up. There's no historical marker, no mention in the county archives that aren't sealed. The house is gone. The family name exists only in records most people will never see. And yet, the sons remain, not in memory because memory fades, but in the land itself. In the stories people tell their children about why you don't go near the old Elridge property after dark. In the way animals still avoid that stretch of woods. In the reports, rare but consistent, of 3 figures seen standing in formation, always watching, always waiting, never aging, never dying, never fully alive. There's a theory, proposed by a geneticist who studied the unsealed medical files, that the son's condition created a kind of stasis, that their bodies, unable to process normal cellular division because of the genetic damage, entered a state of suspended animation, not death, not life, but something in between. A biological purgatory where the body continues to function, but the mind, the self, the thing that makes us individuals, is trapped in a loop it can never escape. She theorized that the sons might still be alive in some form, their cells locked in a pattern that resists decay, resists death, resists everything except existence itself. She published this theory once in a small medical journal in 2003. She received so many threats and so much backlash from the academic community that she retracted it. But she never said she was wrong. She just said she wished she'd never looked. If the sons are still out there, and the evidence suggests something is, then they represent the darkest edge of what it means to be human. They are what happens when the body survives but the soul is never given the chance to form. When biology becomes a trap instead of a vessel. When a family's secrets don't just haunt the living, they become the living. And the worst part, the part that keeps people awake at night in Millridge, is that the sons never asked for this. They were born into a structure that was already collapsing. They inherited a code that was already broken. And they've been paying for it ever since, locked in a form they never chose, existing in a state no one should have to endure. The Elridge sons are a reminder that some horrors don't end. They don't resolve. They don't fade into history and become cautionary tales you can safely forget. They remain. They persist and they wait in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to see, for the rest of us to realize that we're not that different from them. That we're all just one generation, one mistake, one folded branch in the family tree away from becoming something that isn't entirely human and isn't entirely alive. Something that exists only because it doesn't know how to stop.